Hello and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In this video I'm going to be looking at opposition to Khrushchev. This is part of my series on Tsarist and Communist Russia, and this video particularly follows on to the three videos that I've done on political authority under Stalin and Khrushchev, as obviously opposition and political authority are very closely linked. This comes from section 4 of the AQA A-level specification 1H, Tsarist and Communist Russia, and it says that you need to know opposition, cultural dissents, communist divisions, hardliners and reformers, opponents of Khrushchev, and his fall from power. So that's what I'm going to try and look at, and this is particularly important in 2022 as this particular bullet point is part of the advanced information. To start off with, I'm going to look at cultural dissidence. Now, as we already know, censorship and the threat of terror had been enormous under Stalin, and therefore he'd eliminated a lot of kind of cultural dissidents against his regime, either by removing their works or quite literally removing those who criticized him. Now, we see a bit of a thaw, a cultural thaw, if you like, under Khrushchev, where new groups of cultural dissidents emerged, and the same threat was maybe not still there. And these writers use their work to convey political messages, often criticizing the regime, both current and past, in the Soviet Union. Now, some of them, such as Patersnak and Grossman, found their work censored and banned. However, cultural dissidence began to flourish. There was underground networks of people who produced and shared works that expressed their political views. There was a new wave of cultural opposition to the regime. Now, this was similar to an extent of things that if we go all the way back to Alexander II, where he'd tried to step back from absolute autocracy and allow a greater degree of freedom, and then being horrified when some of that greater freedom led to criticism of him and his regime. And here we're going to see a similar thing. And in a way, I imagine Khrushchev, they're kind of going, why are you so ungrateful? I've given you the greater freedom, much greater freedom, and less of the stuff you were suffering under Stalin, and my reward for this is you criticize me. So it's again, often in history these things are cyclical. So we see a lowering of the level of terror, and we see cultural opposition emerge. And this dissidence, the dissidence writings, and are tended to focus on the desire for greater democracy, for promotion of human rights, and also the rights of the ethnic and national minorities. Now, all of these things that we've seen horrendously trampled on through Stalin's time in power. So, with literature and poetry readings, well, banned work was often published abroad and then smuggled into the Soviet Union. So one of the examples of this is Dr. Zhivago, which was being published and printed in Italy and then brought into the USSR. And a lot of literature, Dr. Zhivago included. There were organizations like the CIA who were helping getting this dissident literature into the USSR, hoping it would undermine the communist regime. We've got this term samizdat, which is the printing and copying of illegal books, poems, and magazines. These were often manually typed or produced on illegal printing presses, often in the homes of dissidents. And the dissidents would then share these with others in kind of networks that grew up. My favorite of these, mainly just because of its name, which I think would make a great band name, if only if you're looking to set up a band, is the Young Society of Geniuses, which is a group of students who produced the journal The Sphinxes, which published prose and poetry. Again, along those dissident themes already mentioned, criticizing the regime, calling for greater democracy, all those kinds of things. In 1958, a statue to Vladimir Mayakovsky was commissioned by the government and unveiled in Moscow. Now, he'd been a satirical poet who had criticized the Stalinist regime. And so this statue became a focal point, really, and it sparked a number of spontaneous poetry readings in the square where the statue was, and these became more and more frequent and slowly became more and more critical of the current Soviet regime. So obviously you could definitely get away with criticizing Stalin, and we'd seen that Khrushchev had done that himself. But then that started to extend, and they go, well, actually, we're getting this degree of freedom. We'll criticize the current regime as well. In 1961, the KGB intervened and arrested a number of the regular attendees at these poetry readings for political subversion. So the old habits of the Soviet regime had not gone away completely. We can see very clearly from that. Music and ballet were other areas of kind of artistic expression, and the dissidents often wanting access to more Western music. And so we see an underground network of musicians starting to make illegal recordings, and distribution of this kind of black market in illegal music grew. And this became known as the Magnitsizdat, and included illegal recordings of jazz and rock and roll and soul music shared amongst the dissidents. And also amongst the music that was distributed were the works of Yuliyev Kim, whose songs had very kind of political messages, again, about the desire for greater freedom and criticizing the regime. One of the most famous examples of action of a dissident was by the famous ballerina Rudolf Nureyev, who was the most prestigious male ballet dancer in the USSR. He was known to have non-conformist political views, and the KGB didn't want him to be allowed to go on tour overseas. However, he was allowed to go, and in '61 he travelled the ballet to Paris, and when there he defected to the West. And again, so this it gives this idea of dissidence growing, and Khrushchev losing a degree of control. We also see this in art. So under Stalin's regime, we'd had this strong movement to socialist realism, and Khrushchev, a bit like Stalin before him, was really scathing of the work of artists who broke away from this, really, in particular modern art that he really disliked. And there was an example of him visiting an art exhibition in '62 and then criticizing this art. And he said this had no contribution to building a socialist society. However, large numbers of non-conformist artists continued their work in private. Very few of them were arrested or harassed by the authorities, and it seems that art was not something that was considered to be a particular dangerous threat by Khrushchev's regime. Now, the regime responded in various ways to the cultural dissidents. A significant amount of secret police still existed in the Soviet Union, but the extreme end of Stalin's terror had been reduced. So there were thousands of informers working for the KGB, passing on information about the activities of cultural dissidents. And the main risk to the dissidents at this point was being detained in a psychiatric hospital, because essentially they would be deemed to being mad because they were going against the government and against socialist principles. And this particularly became the case in the early '60s. In 1961, 130,000 people were identified as leading an antisocial, parasitic way of life and were banned from being employed by the state, which with the command economy is a big deal. Some were sent to labour camps and others to mental hospitals. So again, the reach of the secret police and the power of the state had not gone away completely. These measures are definitively less extreme than they were in Stalin. There's a lot less shooting of people, for example. The regime had not abandoned its intent to influence cultural output in the USSR. So after '62, the hardliners in the Presidium were able to bring about a bit of a tightening control. We see Alexander Solzhenitsyn not being allowed to publish his next novels. Again, there were some parallels with the reign of Alexander II, where we get a relaxation of censorship, a realization that means people are going to be critical of the regime, and then a kind of pulling back from that a few years later. So we see then towards the end of Khrushchev's time in power an attempt really to reassert government control of cultural output. Now, there were divisions within the Communist Party, and there were a growing number of opponents of Khrushchev within the party as well. So throughout the power struggle following Stalin's death, and in the period when he was a single leader, Khrushchev faced opposition. Now, he was a reformer who was prepared to denounce and undermine the Stalinist hardliners who had been leading figures before '53. Now, obviously, they aren't just going to accept this. So initially, they're on the back foot, but they didn't give up their attempt to kind of limit Khrushchev's reforms and return to a more Stalinistic approach. The hardliners were horrified by Khrushchev's secret speech in '56, which criticized the Stalinist regime and therefore, in effect, them, pointing to the radical criticism of the regime which Khrushchev's speech has inspired. So again, they suggested this was kind of the beginning of the end in a way, potentially, and that the party had to re-establish control. And Khrushchev was forced to kind of tone down his anti-Stalinistic rhetoric until the 22nd Party Congress in '61. So there is an internal strife over this relaxation, this reform that Khrushchev has carried out, and the hardliners in the party are pulling in one direction, whilst he's got the dissidents outside the party who are pulling in the other. And Khrushchev finds himself in that slightly uncomfortable position in the middle. The most significant opposition to Khrushchev within the party was the anti-party group of '57, and this was coordinated by the hardline opponents of Khrushchev within the Presidium. So Khrushchev initially was able to survive this attempt to remove him through the support again of Marshal Zhukov and the Red Army. But a bit like I talked about when I did the videos on political authority, what we're saying here is this movement towards the power of the army, which is not necessarily going to be a positive thing in the longer term for the idea of reform. Now, even Bulganin, who was a former close ally of Khrushchev, was implicated in the plot and forced to resign. Now, following the failure of the anti-party group in '57, Molotov was demoted to being ambassador to Mongolia. Kaganovich was made director of a cement works. And the renewal of Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign in '61 saw both men expelled from the party. Other hardliners, however, such as Shushlev, continued their opposition to Khrushchev from within the party. And there's another big difference in here, is that we're seeing demotions and things like that rather than executions and show trials. Now, Khrushchev's reorganization of responsibility in the economy was seen as being partly political. By decentralizing control of the economy and giving more to local regions, Khrushchev was hoping to undermine the state ministers in Moscow, which were largely loyal to the Stalinist hardliners and wanting to maintain their control over running the economy. So Khrushchev had personally ordered the publication of One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisonovich, which he felt would undermine the hardliners who had been most associated with the terror and the labor camps, again conveniently forgetting his own support for the purges in both Moscow and the Ukraine. Now, the hardliners responded by preventing the publication of any more of Shulhansky's novels after '62, pointing to the dangerous levels of dissidence that Khrushchev's Thora had created. Again, it was a bit like the reactionaries did under Alexander II. There's some huge parallels here. So Khrushchev, again, is being harassed by the hardliners on one side, and his leniency, allowing the growth of dissidents, is being used as a kind of a weapon against him. Moving on to Khrushchev's fall from power. Now, Khrushchev didn't necessarily do a huge amount to help himself with this, and we can put some of his failings down to his own personality. He was impulsive, he was unpredictable, he was occasionally explosive, and in this lost him friends and allies. He had a habit of insulting colleagues with whom he disagreed, something that many of them didn't forget and held against him. The group that deposed him in '64 accused him of arrogance, and which, with the way that he behaved towards his colleagues, is something that you can maybe see. Another charge against him was that he had harebrained scheming. In other words, implementing several ideas which hadn't been properly thought out, or that weren't properly planned. And that this was particularly an accusation against his agricultural initiative, an area which Khrushchev claimed to be a great expert, and is in his constant reorganization of the party and government. Khrushchev's behavior abroad also brought disapproval. The most notorious example is when he banged his shoe on the table at the United Nations General Assembly in 1960, and which many of his colleagues in the USSR thought was kind of humiliating for both him and the country. And there was a number of issues which increased oppositions to Khrushchev within the party in the early 1960s. The Cuban Missile Crisis is probably the most famous and most significant event in the time that Khrushchev is in office. Now, Khrushchev had intended to use the recent revolution in Cuba to the USSR's advantage by placing nuclear weapons on the island, which was only 90 miles from the US coast. Kennedy responded by placing a naval blockade around Cuba and threatening war if any missiles were delivered. The world stood on the brink of nuclear war, and Khrushchev backed down. He and Kennedy did a deal which saw the removal of Soviet missiles from Cuba and of American missiles from Turkey. And that element of the deal, however, was kept secret. And in the eyes of the world, it was Kennedy who was seen to be the victor and Khrushchev who would back down. So although we would now all look back with great gratitude to Khrushchev and see this as a really significant moment in world history in which the horrors of a nuclear war were averted, and therefore give him great credit, he didn't get great credit in the Soviet Union, as he was seen again to have been weak and to have been backed down. And you can almost hear the voices of the hardliners saying Stalin wouldn't have backed down. And well, with a disregard for human life, I think that's probably clear that Stalin wouldn't have done. Another area in which he failed again is this area where he claimed to be the great expert, which was agriculture. The Virgin Land Scheme failed. Rather embarrassingly, the shortage of grain led to the Soviet Union having to import grain from both the USA and Canada. The Virgin Land Scheme was simply not the solution to the USSR's food supply problems that Khrushchev had said it was going to be, and the harvest of '63 was particularly poor, and this is an important step in the fall of Khrushchev. The style of leadership and opposition within the military. So Khrushchev was accused of not listening to the advice of those around him and carrying a kind of a one-man style rule. So having been highly critical of Stalin and the cult of personality, this is not necessarily a good move. He was impulsive in his decision making, and as I've already mentioned, his harebrained schemes cause opposition. Now we see a good example in this. His son-in-law was made editor of a key newspaper, elected to the Central Committee, and sent on diplomatic mission to West Germany. Khrushchev is disregarding proper channels of political patronage and authority, and we're seeing really strong suggestion here of nepotism. We start to see growing opposition within the military. The military leaders resented cuts to conventional military spending, which had instead been diverted to the nuclear weapons program. This reliance on nuclear weapons was undermined by the Cuban Missile Crisis. and the opposition to Khrushchev in the military used this against him. And so having essentially used the military as an important kind of post to lean on in gaining power, and we see the removal of Berry, and we see it in his economic strategy, kind of leaning more towards heavy industry and military and away from consumer goods. We kind of see the beginning of Khrushchev facing a monster of his own creation, really. With reorganization of the state and party bureaucracies between 56 and 61, Khrushchev replaced over 2/3 of the Presidium, the Council of Ministers and party secretaries. In addition to this, half of the Central Committee. So again, part of the resentment against Khrushchev was this constant change, this enormous turnover of people in these important positions. In 61, he limited to 3 the number of times the leading officials could be elected to the same office. At each election, he also insisted that a quarter of the Central Committee and the Presidium be replaced. So again, people who had built up their power bases and got to a strong position were now being moved out of the way and were going to resist doing this. His policy of decentralization and giving more responsibility to local party leaders and regional economic councils upset those in central government who were losing some of their power and authority. In 62, he divided the party into 2 parallel hierarchies, one responsible for industry, the other for agriculture. Again, not something that was hugely popular within the bureaucracy itself. So, to the fall of Khrushchev. In October 64, Khrushchev was on holiday in Georgia when he received a telephone call from Brezhnev, the chairman of the Presidium, summoning him to Moscow for an emergency meeting of the Presidium, where Khrushchev was then attacked on a number of accounts. So he's torn down on policy and personality and all these different things. He refused to resign. He was denied access to the media, preventing him raising support. On the following day, he was presented with a resignation paper to sign, which he eventually did. On the third day, Suslov read out a list of Khrushchev's shortcomings, and the Presidium passed a resolution making Brezhnev first secretary of the Communist Party and Alexei Kosygin premier of the Soviet Union. So again, dividing those 2 jobs. It was announced in public that Khrushchev had resigned due to advanced age and ill health. The newspaper edited by his son-in-law was not published that day, so only the official version of Khrushchev's downfall was available. A few weeks later, the state newspaper Pravda denounced Khrushchev for his harebrained schemes, half-baked conclusions and hasty decisions, unrealistic actions, bragging, phrase-mongering, and bossiness. So it's a condemning, but it's not quite as severe as what we see with de-Stalinization, is it? In terms of the high crimes and misdemeanors, really, of Khrushchev, of nothing really on what Stalin's did. And what we do, however, see is Khrushchev's reforms affecting agriculture, economic decentralization, and party reorganization were swiftly abandoned by his successors. So Khrushchev is time in office is seen as a brief period of reform, really, which soon collapses. But some of the changes that he brought about did stay in place for him, at least. So Khrushchev was not shot. As someone in this kind of position and this public denunciation in Stalin's time would have been. He was allowed to retire and claim a pension, and he spent the years until his death in 1971, living in fair obscurity outside Moscow, writing his memoirs. When he died, there was a 4-line announcement in Pravda with no comment or obituary. His burial was a very, very small affair, and none of his former colleagues were in attendance. So Khrushchev goes out with more of a whimper than a bang, really. So he is the reformer that follows Stalin. He receives opposition from dissidents, who he gave slightly greater freedom to, But the opposition that really matters is within the party, and it's the opposition from the hardliners who dislike the reform and use the fact that his reform has led to cultural dissidence as evidence that he has lost control. There are also failings in his policies which contribute to his fall and give his opponents ammunition to use against him. But interestingly, one thing that seems to have carried through his reforms is when we talk about them using ammunition against him, it is at least words and not bullets. And so we see Khrushchev able to actually live out his days. Thank you very much for watching. I hope that's been helpful for you in your understanding in opposition to Khrushchev and Khrushchev's fall. If you've liked it, then please hit the like button. If you haven't already subscribed to my channel, then please do. There's lots more on this topic, on Soviet and Tsarist Russia. There's also a range of things on other history topics, including Tudor Britain, the American Civil War, modern Britain as well. So a whole range of different things on there, and also a whole heap of stuff on A-level politics as well. So thank you very much for watching.